Basie. Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A musical good evening to you. Tuesday night here in Manhattan and Tuesday across the NBC network. Tells it's time for music of Count Basie and his orchestra. Coming to you from Birdland, jazz corner of the world, right here, 52nd Street, Broadway. 25 musical moments with the one and only Count Basie. Well, musically speaking, we're going to start things off. Eddie Davis and, of course, Joe Martin. Joe Newman on trumpet. Coming forth with Count Basie and Fancy Meeting You here. Yes, fancy meeting you here. Count Basie, the orchestra. Birdland, right here in New York City. Well, that spotlight falls on three other members of the Count Basie aggregation. Paul Quintachet, Jimmy Wilkins, Marshall Royal, Count in the orchestra, and a little Basie kick.
I love... Because then I'm like, is it this or that? Here, like, you're sorting me out, man. All right. All right. So I'm putting in a long day yesterday, and it's like 9 o'clock at night, and I didn't even have time to make, a good dinner. And so that, like, the cheesy dinners for us is like, oh, let's do charcuterie, because then we feel like we're doing something, but really, no, we just like sliced up a bunch of cheese and threw some fruit on a board, um, or we'll do breakfast, right? And so I made us a couple of French omelets and some country potatoes, and it was good and everything, but it's like just something you can do super quick, and you don't have to have a lot of expensive gear or anything. You just throw it together. So I'm sitting there eating way too late because I'm trying to work on all the rebranding stuff we got going on here, and I get a text or a ping from an old friend who's watching the podcast, and I'm just like, that is so cool. It's awesome when the people start to lean into the discussion here, because what we're talking about ultimately is not daily devotional stuff. That's awesome. Do that stuff, right? But we're talking about how to sow unity in our faith that's divided. We have so many different denominations. We have all the things. And what if, there's only one Jesus, one God, one faith, one hope. And so it just bugs me that we just kind of go, ugh, that's too big of a problem. I'm going to turn away and not really worry about it, right? And so it's just, it's awesome. So many of the people that I know lean into this discussion, and we're starting to figure out how to, stop treating Jesus like I get to have my own individual little canvas that I keep with me, and it's my Jesus, and, tearing up that individual canvas and putting a canvas on the wall and working on it together. And that starts life to life. And that's the same thing with our political divides and everything else. We like to think, well, that's a big picture down situation. It's really not. If we could figure out how to talk to each other as neighbors and friends, all of the problem essentially just goes away, And that's what that whole thing is about. And so the appeal to unity is really an appeal to love your neighbor and love your brother and love the people that you can take to coffee. That's really what it's all about. So, man, I'm super thrilled that you're watching, dude, and I hope you appreciate the rebrand. I hope you appreciate all the tunes and the genres and the retros, because I know you and I like a lot of that stuff. And just remember, there's 3 things to unity that we're going to keep talking about over and over and over again. We have such a hard time with unity in the Christian faith because we don't know how to have good conversations about Jesus where we disagree, or about faith where we disagree. Instead, we go, oh, well, you think that, and then we just are dismissive because we don't want the fight. And so we've settled with the idea that we're either going to fight or we're going to dismiss each other. And then, we don't have a solution for how to talk to each other, because we know that if we come together and talk to each other, even if we heard each other and understood each other, how are we going to work out our differences over Jesus? Like, what's the plumb line? How do we determine, when we have to change, and how do we answer the question of Jesus in the same way and have some kind of chance of coming up with the same answer when we say, who is Jesus? So we don't have good conversations because we don't know how to have good conversations where we disagree. We don't have a solution for how to answer the question of Jesus together that's functional, life to life. And then the other thing is, we're kind of too cool for change. We think change is what a baby Christian does. And we got that flipped on its head, man. The more I follow Jesus, the more proud I am of my change, because that's the good stuff. The part of me that I'm leaving behind. Many of you who knew me, 20, 30 years ago and knew what an insecure little jerk I could be at times. Hopefully you see that I'm at least a little bit less. I'm not the man I was. And that's not because of me. It's because of Christ in me and Jesus and his transformational work in my life. I hope that's what you're experiencing. But man, change is the evidence of champions here in the Christian faith, that we press on towards the prize, to live more like Jesus every day. So today I'm going to give you a controversy warning. All right. We're going to talk about something controversial, and we're going to talk about it. And look, it doesn't have to be a big thing. But I'm going to bring up something that is a comment about something that's happening in the socio-political world. And I'm going to talk about why it misses the mark in terms of inviting unity. All right. And, I mean, that's a pretty easy, it's low-hanging fruit. But I want to get into the semantics of why. And we're going to talk about what it is to straw man someone or to miss their point, and why that's so important, and why Jesus would want us to do better than that. And, we can't do like Jesus if we've decided that we're too good to really understand what someone else thinks. That's just the way it is. So if we want unity, and if we want peace in our broken culture, what we really have to do is to be able to understand the best argument of those we disagree with. And that's how we're going to have unity. And I want more unity in following Jesus. That's what I do. I follow Jesus, and I want to follow Jesus with others. And that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to take another step together towards greater unity and following Jesus together. All right, let's take another step and take it away, Chuck.
And being willing to be less than the least became the greatest of all. Let us imitate him who was King of kings and yet a servant of servants.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
Would you turn on my microphone, please?
It's right here in the hall closet.
That's my hall closet, 100%. Anyone else? Look, why is it not like Jesus to straw man? Like, why wouldn't Jesus straw man someone? You guys all know what a straw man is, right? It's where, someone has a position, and instead of dealing with the strongest parts of their position, right? Like the strength of their argument, we kind of skirt around the edges, and we find things that may not even represent their position, but they're certainly not the strongest part of their position. And we treat those as if they're the pillars that they built their idea on. And because they're not, it's just like the straw man. It's just, the scarecrow you put up in the field. It's easy to knock down. It's easy to defeat. There's nothing to it because it's a stuffed shirt. It's like we if you've ever had someone do that to you, sometimes it can feel like they're using words that appear like they're trying to talk to you, but they're kind of looking over here at someone completely different that doesn't represent what you think or who you are. And it sucks, man. It's sorry if you got kids watching. I know the S word is big in the faith, and man, my language has come a long way since Jesus has got a hold of me. But but sometimes the SUCKS word still sneaks in there. All right, but look, I got a 6-year-old, so I'm like massively aware of that stuff. But that's what a straw man is, right? So why doesn't Jesus like straw man? What's the problem with it? Well, for one, it makes us, it makes us confident in our judgment of others. So we might not be seeing someone else or hearing their argument the way they are. We've predetermined they're wrong. And if we engage in the straw man, then we can build up our own self-confidence about our criticism of them. Well, certainly they're wrong because, see, I took the worst part of their idea and I decimated it. And so that makes me right. And it's lying to ourselves when we look in the mirror. I haven't really engaged in the full merits of their idea. I haven't really engaged in the strength of their argument. So my idea or my viewpoint might be lacking, but I can't be bothered. Okay, so it turns us back onto our own false judgment of others. It also avoids humility. And, I'll often say this, that maybe not all pride. Some of us, some people we come by pride honestly, narcissism or whatever the thing. But for a lot of us, pride is actually not pride. There's a bunch of fear underneath. And we've just kind of put on this armor of pride, like to keep anyone from seeing what's underneath the thick candy shell, Well, it's not really candy though. But, we're defensive. And then it polarizes and it shrinks our ability to reason, right? So if I engage in the straw man, then it's easy for me to say I have my idea, which is the right idea, and there's the other idea. And those are the only two things I have to wrestle with. And if those are the only two things that I have to wrestle with, then it's easy for me to say I'm right, because there's only two ideas, my idea and the wrong idea. And that's what happens when we straw man, because then we can lump everything we disagree with onto the straw man and forget any nuance of position or any variance of position, any subtle disagreements or any strength of argument from anyone. And so, look, it makes us confident in our false judgment. It avoids humility, right? And just turns us right back into pride. And it polarizes or shrinks our ability to reason. It actually makes us closed-minded when we straw man. There was a clip I was watching, and I looked for it. I couldn't find it. But they were talking about statistics. They had done some study, and they had people examine a magazine ad. Maybe you've seen this clip. And they said, if you count how many pictures are in this ad or on this magazine page, then, we'll give you some money. And, I don't know, $1,000 or whatever it was. It was, a good amount. And there's an ad in the middle of the page that said there are 47 pictures on this page. And those who kept an open mind found that. And then, perceived themselves to be more lucky, right? And those who had a closed mind or were hyper-focused missed it. So when we become hyper-focused and when we shrink the options and when we look at binary situations, and we don't want to put it on a spectrum either, because a spectrum just affirms the binary. It's just a binary, it's a spectrum between two binaries. Instead, you want to let there be a plethora of ideas out there, and maybe some of them overlap, like circles on paper, that some of them are way out over here and some of them are overlapping, right? So we don't want to fall into that kind of binary mindset, because that binary mindset, it actually makes us small-minded. It makes us midwits, right? Not nitwits, but midwits, right? We're smart enough to be eloquent. We're smart enough to turn on the news, but we're not smart enough to really understand on a deep level the facts and the situation. Now, my concern as a Christian here, as a follower of Jesus, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So whether or not I think something is right or wrong is the caboose of the engine that drives the train when I start to dig into conflict and situations where there's conflict. I'm first thinking about, okay, what are the verifiable facts underneath this, right? And facts don't really have opinions. They just are, right? Either I got out of bed this morning or I didn't. Whether I liked it, that's subjective, right? And I can tell you that. But no, I wanted to be in bed. No, I wanted to be with you. I take that back. No, I truly am really grateful to be here. Sorry, my chair, I need a new chair. First world problems. This really comfortable chair I have, it's just slightly off. So, yeah, thanks. Producer Snurdly. I could take his. I'll just ship it out from Kentucky. You gonna pay? Oh, gosh, man. A leather reclinable chair. Yeah, that's the issue. Where was I? Look, a bird. I am so grateful for you guys this morning. And that's the thing. We don't want to be small-minded. We don't want to be midwits. So I'm going to set this up here a little bit. I'm going to show this political comic. And I'm not going to tell you what you have to believe about things or what your opinion is. Now, I have an opinion, and you may, kind of read between the lines and pick up some nuance of my opinion as I talk. None of us are impartial, but even if you do that, my point here is not to pick up and say, this is what you have to believe about this. What we're looking at is, what does this type of communication do? And also, I want to point out that I'm not upset by the satire, okay, or the jabs. Jabs and satire are fine. Jesus did jabs, he did satire, he did biting words. That's fine for us to engage in as Christians if we do it like Jesus. The one thing that Jesus didn't do is straw man his opponents. Like, at no point did Jesus stand there in the temple court or be talking to a Pharisee, a Sadducee, a scribe, or a general hater. And after he criticizes them, they say, but Jesus, that's not really what I think. Right? But that kind of misses the point of what I'm saying. No. At every point when Jesus used biting terms and harsh words and criticism and jabs and insults and hyperbole to cut to the quick of things, he never missed someone's argument. And so if we are going to use satire, if we're going to use that stuff, shouldn't we do it like Jesus? Or is it okay if we miss someone's position? So that's what we're going to talk about. It's not the opinion that I care about. It's not the use of satire. But what I care about is how can we sow peace? And sometimes using a biting political comic or something like that, or a satire piece, sometimes that gets the point across. And it stinks, but sometimes that communicates. And when it hits us, we're like, ugh, and that kind of stung a little bit. But if we're intellectually honest, we'll see the truth of it. Where it fails is where we miss someone's point. And so before we get there too, I want to talk about what is the difference between peace and dismissiveness. So we're going to bring up, I want to look at Corinthians here real quick. And in this passage in Corinthians, you've seen this. It talks about the ministry of reconciliation. And, two passages here real quick. And one I probably should have brought up in the beginning. One of them, and this is, thank you, Bible Gateway, for daily encouragement from Max. Hey, Max, I appreciate you. But, all right. So, I used to read a lot of Max Lucado in my early 20s. Lucado, tomato, whatever it is. I appreciate the guy. He's a nice guy. I don't always agree with him, but I appreciate his heart. Bless your heart. I don't mean to do that to him. Sorry. Okay. 1 Corinthians 1:10. I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. We talked about Euodia and Syntyche last week from Philippians chapter 4, and we talked about that they agree in Christ and what that meant, that they be of the same mind and the same thought, that the word yoke fellows was used in the passage, that we're all pulling on the cart in the same direction. This is a process because we're imperfect. We're broken people. And so as God is transforming us and we notice where we disagree, it's up to us to be charitable to our brother and sister and lean in as much as it matters to them. That's the big key. And if we're going to have the same mind over Christ, when we realize we disagree about who Jesus is or what that means, we lean in and we show humility, right? And I always say humility, not grace, because, charity might be a better word. Be charitable to others' position. But grace it often implies that someone's wrong. I'm giving you grace because I'm right and you're wrong. And well, you'll get there eventually. Trust me, brother. It's in there. Put your hand on someone's shoulder, whatever. All right. But here's this whole passage at the end of 2 Corinthians. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh, even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh. We regard him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. And this is one of those paradoxes in Scripture because, like in Philippians 1:6, he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. That the idea is that God is reworking us and reshaping us. And we all know we're not perfect. So that's the truth. But then Paul also turns around and refers to us as new creations, believers as new. The new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, Christ was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. And therefore we are ambassadors of Christ, and God making his appeal through us. If, and we implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. I hesitated on whether or not I was going to read verse 21, because it's like, Paul has a great way of saying a lot with a few words. The point is, if we're going to reconcile to God, what did Jesus say was the summing up of the commandments? Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And if God is pursuing man and we're going to reconcile to God and, tell our brother to pound sand, is that really reconciling to God? I don't think that's reconciling to God, to deny the heart of God and his love for others and say we're reconciling to God. And so the whole point of the ministry of reconciliation is that we are reconciling to God with others and reconciling others to ourselves and bearing one another's burden with love. That's kind of the point of this. So here's why if we want to make peace, if you want to be a peacemaker, then we have to figure out how do you make peace between two nations if you don't understand their interests? This is why it always bugs me, if they shame someone for talking to, a horrible foreign leader. It's like, well, how are you gonna sow peace if you never? The moment you stop talking, all you have left is violence. And so when we shame someone from talking to someone or having meetings or conversations, what we're saying is what we really want is violence. And that's what I hate so much about a society that would say, don't talk about the things where you disagree. Because if you don't talk about them, you can't sow peace. And if you can't sow peace, eventually, that will turn to violence. And that's not what I want. Eventually, someone's going to cross that line of violence. So that's why conversations and understanding people is so important. And we've seen that happen throughout history in nations. When the conversation breaks down, things go south quick. All right, so just a reminder, I'm not going to try and take sides on this meme. My position might bleed through, but I'm going to try and handle this stuff so that we can focus on the life-to-life aspect of it, that we can focus on how we can have conversations in person and be willing to. If we're not willing to rethink our position, we have no business engaging in a conversation, right? That is the very nature of authoritarianism. And authoritarianism starts with an individual. It starts with me saying I'm better than you. I can't hear you, or I can't understand you. And yet we do that in our churches often. And it's sad because it's the very dissent that the whole Protestant movement had and the Reformers had against the idea of the Catholic Church, that you get to be right because you're in charge. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense. Shouldn't we sola scriptura? And that's where that argument of Bible only comes from. All right, well, look, let's take a look at this meme. Don't be shocked. I know that was a ton of preamble to get into it, but let's have a look here and see what's going on. Sorry. Go ahead, producer Rob. I'm pushing buttons when I shouldn't be pushing buttons. So that's that's what happens when you have two steering wheels in a car, right? That's why they don't let adults drive those driver's ed cars with the two steering wheels. It just goes wrong. Yeah, side seat driving. It gets a whole new name there. Okay, so look. Here's the meme, and again, I have no objection to the satire at all, and especially because these people who are in the meme are public figures, and they have put themselves out there in the public, so it's fair enough to contemplate on them. But let's just walk through the meme and see if we can understand what the person who put this together is saying. And this is from at vvibes818, VV whatever. You can see at the bottom right there. This is a Christian nation, says Franklin Graham in the top panel, and Doug Wilson, bring God back into the public sphere. And then you've got, I'm guessing that's 700 Club. I don't really watch him. Is that Pat? Is that guy's name Pat? Pat Roberts. Yeah. Robertson. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I don't know those guys. I have no idea what their position on anything really is. But fighting Iran is a holy war. So I don't know. And then you've got the Trump administration, and you've got Hegseth in Crusader robes, which then again, there's a whole bit of... Go ahead. Yeah, you're saying... I'm sorry, I had producer Snurdley's mic off, so he's on here. And yeah, pretty cool look, right? I mean, whatever, but my kid would look at that and go, "Oh, cool, who's the knight?"
Exactly.
But it kind of misses the Crusades in some point, but I'm not going to get sidetracked on the history of that. We all know the trope of the Crusades. But I think, if your idea of the Crusades is that, Christians were killing people because they didn't believe in Jesus, then I think read some history on that. There's some good podcasts that you can really check out. There's a YouTube channel, Ryan M. Reese, Reece, I think, who does little 30-minute segments on Christian history and goes into the Crusades, and he's got a really good, he's really fair-minded, and tells both sides. Anyway, so they're all saying, well said, and then the Pope says, we must strive for peace and not use God to justify violence. And then the Trump administration turn around and say, religion needs to stay out of U.S. policy. Okay. So why did I bring this up when it's a straw man, or for the straw man, or when we're talking about straw man? And so obviously I think this is a straw man. Well, I would think if it's the first two panels, that's one statement, and that's a hyperbolic criticism. But I wouldn't agree with the idea that the top panel is actually representative of what these people are saying. Again, I'm going to set aside the 700 Club because I just don't watch them. But, and I'm not tuned into Franklin Graham every day, but I'm familiar with his comments on this. And I'm familiar with Doug Wilson's comments on this. And so right there, that's one thing for to miss what they're saying about God in the public sphere, and to miss what they're saying about the nation and Christianity and those arguments. And if you don't know those arguments, I would say dive into those arguments. Understand the strength of their position and what they're saying. I might suggest listening to a reel or a short from someone like Dennis Prager, talking about cut flower philosophy. But the idea is essentially that there was, who was it? This, who said that our Constitution was meant for a just and moral people, right? Which founding father? Man, I want to Google that. All right, you guys can look that up. Maybe I misframed that. The point is that every nation and every society has a national kind of ethos and ethic. And when that nation moves apart from that ethic, it stops becoming what it was. And so their argument is that the ideas of freedom and of liberty are ideas that were founded upon Protestant Judeo-Christian ideology. And that's what birthed the ethos of the country. And when we try and get rid of that root, then we lose our way with morality. Now, they all have different arguments for why they believe these different things, but I think it would be fair to do the first two panels and make that its own meme. The problem is they've made so many assumptions about those panels, about people's motives, and what their motives are in terms of the Iran war. And then they bring up the Pope. And this is not what I understand the Pope to have said. I believe that the Pope said something that was. Let me see. I have his comments here. Let me pull up his comments.
While you're doing that, just so you know, it was John Adams. Moral and religious people, it is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.
Yeah, that the Constitution is meant for. Say that one more time.
For moral and religious people.
Yeah, and it is wholly inadequate to any other.
The government of any other.
Yep. Okay. Now.
Sorry.
No, that's great, man. And I got you live, so just so you know, everyone say hi to producer Snerdley, or Birdley, not Snerdley, Snow Birdley. There you go.
Different guy.
I know, that's a different producer on a different show. All right, look, here's the deal. So the Pope was decrying war in general. Hey, look, we don't need to, we need to be people of peace and not use God to justify violence. And that means that war is violence, right? So a consistent moral position here would be to be against World War II. So that's the question. Would the creator of this meme also disagree with our involvement in World War II? There's your kind of litmus test on if we're strawmanning or not. If they disagree with World War II, then the position that they're trying to say from the Pope, because that's the Pope's comment, if the Pope is against World War II, then he's got a morally just and consistent position. And listen, that's fine, because like Dietrich Bonhoeffer is one of my personal heroes. I don't agree with all of his theology, but he wrestled deeply with pacifism and was very torn about getting involved in house churches in Germany that eventually led to his death. But he was no hypocrite. He's one of the quotes he's famous for is saying, when God calls a man, he bids him come and die. And I couldn't agree with that more. And so I get the idea that we might take a stance that there is no just war for the Christian. That's a fair position. And again, I'm not trying to weigh in on that. However, if we think, if the Pope would agree that World War II and involvement against Hitler in World War II was just, then it's a misapplied comment, because it misses the strongest arguments for the Trump administration and these other, Doug Wilson, Franklin Graham. What are their strongest arguments for being involved in a war with Iran? What is the strongest case for that? So, for example, the counter will say, well, Japan hit America first, and so we were just defending ourselves and the Jews. Well, and we had suspicions about the Jews, but until they really liberated those camps, they had no idea how absolutely horrible it actually was. I mean, some people knew, but that was shocking for the world when the atrocities came to light for everyone to see, right? But here's the thing: there's decades of Iran shouting "Death to America." This is, they do it every Friday. Literally shout, "Death to America" and "Death to Israel," right? They kidnapped 66 American hostages in 79 through 81. We all remember the Iran hostage crisis. And, some people say, well, that cost Jimmy Carter a second term, and whatever the case is on that. There's the Iran-backed Hezbollah bombings in 83, the Beirut death toll, 161. And 241 U.S. Marines killed. They again bombed an embassy in Beirut, and 33 killed, 80 hurt. In 84, they bombed an embassy annex. The Iran-linked Khobar Towers bombing, 19 U.S. airmen killed. That was 1996. And in 2000s, during the Iraq War, Iran wasn't silent. They were actually using EFPs and via militias to kill American troops, right? In 2020, they directly fired missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq. And that's, post Soleimani. So, it's not like we haven't been doing anything this whole time. The question is, was there already a conflict? That's the question to answer. If there was already a conflict, and we do believe that there are just wars, and if the uranium situation is the way that it is, if those are the cases, then the premise is it's just, right? And so to miss that argument that there might be a just cause for this, and just to assume that there's no just cause. So you see how I'm saying it's like three different memes going on, all shoved into one. That's why it becomes a straw man. So if they broke that out and just tried to criticize the justness of this war, that would be one thing. But the meme presumes the war to be unjust and gives them a completely uncharitable position. And then it assumes, like I think that the people who would probably like this meme would probably agree that our involvement in World War II was okay. So then the question really is, what makes this just or unjust, and do we know the strongest arguments from the other side? Okay, so that's how we do a criticism. We want to steel man a position instead of straw man a position. And then, it comes back to, religion needs to stay out of politics, which I don't believe is the actual comment. That's also a straw man. I believe it's the Pope needs to stay out of politics, and its criticism
directed directly at the Pope. Yes.
Yeah, it's directed directly at the Pope. Thank you, producer Birdley. I'll get your name right one of these times. So it was directed directly at the Pope, not at religion. So the Pope, from the Vatican, starts to speak into American politics, and the administration disagrees and says, pound sand. Well, whether or not that's the right statement or not, that's just a free speech debate in the public sphere. And, the Pope has in mind something different than this country has in mind, and the nation is having a debate over where should God be in the public square. Are we a completely godless society? In which case, where does our morality come from? And that's kind of what's at stake with, people like Franklin Graham and Doug Wilson. Where would be our justification for not mutilating children because we have some high-minded idea about gender? We sat in a college classroom too long. Where would be our moral ethic when it comes to how, at what point should an abortion be not okay? Spoiler alert, I'm kind of a never guy, but that doesn't mean there's no conversation to be had. And how much of that should be imposed upon society, right? And this is where most of debates on complicated issues will come down. Take the abortion debate. You'll say, well, how many terms? And they'll say, well, it's a woman's choice. Okay, totally fine. But is there ever a point, like postpartum? That's not happening. Well, here's a case of it happening. Well, and so the argument becomes circular because we want to sloganize the argument and misrepresent the strongest case from the other side. And I could flip that on its head. And I could, as someone who's generally has a conservative position on that issue, I could come to understand the problem of the state saying, here is a rule about something that is in the medical sphere, right? That would upset a lot of libertarian ideology. Right? Hey, we're going to make this rule on abortion. Well, that's in the medical sphere. And I can go and empathize with that position, and I can hear and I can understand. And when we understand each other's strongest position, then our criticisms and our jabs actually have hooks. But what happens is a conservative flips by this and they just roll their eyes. And so what it does is it riles up the division because it fails to actually jab at the conservatives for something jab worthy. Does that make sense? So if we want to avoid the straw man, we have to know the strongest case of someone else, right? Why does this kind of thing polarize us? I don't want to go on this anymore. I hope you get the point. Just realize, totally fine to share things like this, but don't share this one. Share ones that are actual strong critique. Maybe even consider sharing it with your conservative friend first. Or if you're a conservative, share it with your more liberal-minded friend. Make sure that the criticism is substantive for their strongest argument, and we call that steel manning. This is what we do in faith all the time. I'm going to let you do that. I know, I've got to keep my hands off the... I'm used to having my fingers all over the changers and the switchers here. This is the issue of this. And I didn't mean to bring that up, that political comment, to upset anyone, or again, to take a stand on whether or not we should be involved in the war or not involved in the war. I certainly have an opinion. I think it's worth talking about, but I'm going to have those discussions with the people I can look on their face, and we can have coffee, and we can begin to wrestle with this together and find some unity in Jesus over the issue, because there is nothing in the sphere of this world that Jesus doesn't care about. And when we realize we disagree as Jesus followers, there's a moment where the light can't shine as bright as it could if we had unity, if we were of the same mind. And so we lean into reconciling ourselves to God together, to the vision of Jesus, to the bright light of Jesus, because Jesus was very much political. He walked right into the middle of the political powers and the political authorities and torqued them off in the strongest possible way. He said, basically, come at me, bro. Right? We get that example in Luke 15, I believe, where Jesus has the crowds behind him, and the crowds behind him are not all the best crowds, right? And some of them are his followers, and some of them are who knows, but they're behind him, because that first century world was basically divided over two things at the time of Jesus. Was the baptism of John from God or not? And so Jesus asks the religious leaders, hey, who's John's baptism? Was it from God or was it from man? And what do they say? Well, we don't want to say it's from man, because that crowd behind Jesus will kill us, right? And so Jesus is aware of the tumult and the crowd behind him. He's aware of the conflict. And this is a highly charged political moment. And they say, but we don't want to say it's from God, because then he'll say, well, why didn't you believe him? Why didn't you take it? So Jesus was someone who walked right into the middle of the politics. But if we're going to live like Jesus, we have to understand the how and the why behind what he did. And that means we have to understand a little bit of history, a little bit of context. Here's the thing. Ultimately, pick one. Where do you want to criticize, right? Criticize their take on whether or not the war is just. Criticize their take on whether or not there ever is a just war. Criticize their criticism of the Pope. But to call them hypocrites because we've misrepresented their initial position, and then to put a quote in their mouth that isn't what they were meaning, that it's not the religion of the Pope that made them upset with the Pope, it's the Pope himself, that they think he's a clown, and so they're not a big fan, right? So if they're not a big fan of an individual and they criticize an individual, is that a criticism of religion speaking into the conversation, or is that a criticism of the opinion of one person speaking into the conversation? So we need to actually understand the nuances, steelman the position, and then by all means, let your memes fly, right? If a meme gets me and it's truthful, I go, it gives me something to think about. But we can do better. We can do better on the internet. The problem is this isn't just an internet thing. We do this life to life. And so why does this kind of thing polarize us? Why does this divide us? Well, I was worried about even bringing up that meme, to be honest, a little bit, because I'm worried that, maybe it's going to be too political for people. Well, they're going to see that I want to talk politics. And that's where I say, I'm sorry, everything. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. And if he is the king of this world and I am his subject, I will speak into the public sphere, and I will stand not for politics, but for truth. And we often conflate standing for our political opinion and standing for the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter is that where we disagree, Jesus would have us empathize. This is what Jesus did. He made him a little lower than the angels, right? That God was born as a man in the person of Jesus and walked in our footsteps. And we talked about he grew in wisdom and stature yesterday, that he walked and saw through our eyes for 30 years before he opened up his mouth. He was not confused about what the positions were. He was not tribalistic. He was not just posting a meme that'll get a bunch of likes from his own side and feeding his own endorphins and dopamine. He was actually engaging in this substantive position with a critique that was truthful, that was God's truth. And so, yes, speak into the public sphere. because politics is just a word for anything in the public sphere. But do as Jesus did and be ready for the cross. You know, that's the greatest honor of the follower, that we could follow after Jesus in all things. All right, so why is it tense between followers? All right, well, look, I'm going to hold on. If you want to bump the Be Right Back screen here for a second. All right. And I'm back. Okay, and my guitar's out of tune. And I need to clean my fretboard. And I need to get the thing refretted. All right, and ooh, that's pretty bad, isn't it? All right, but here's the thing. We're going to talk about being out of tune. This is why it gets so bad. See, the thing is, when two strings are out of tune, and they're really close to being out of tune, it's really tense. When they're far out, it's not so bad. Okay, that sounds bad, but it's not as tense as when those two strings start to get really close in pitch. And when they're right there, that's so tense. But if we keep tuning past the tension, then we find our unity. Whew. I need to... I know. All right. That's the thing with tuning our lives. I hear you, you hear me, and here we sit in consideration of each other. And it gets really tense. The greatest tension is when we're not really far apart. And, you know, if you think about it, when I talk to someone who doesn't even believe in Jesus, we're not fighting over baptism, right? We're not having a debate over free will or eschatology or whether or not Jesus would side with this or that politic. You know, it's a relatively peaceful conversation. And if we bring up Jesus, it tends to be relatively peaceful. But it's where we start to get really close but different. That's where things start to break down and get really tense. Why? Why does it get tense like that? Because we don't have a tuner. And when we need a tuning pitch, because the only other situation is to say you have to tune your life to my position, or I have to tune my life to your position. That's not right. We should be tuning our life to God together. So we need that tuning pitch. And when we have that tension, instead of leaning in, it repels us. And think of it like this. I was talking to my friend from Australia the other day, and he was talking about, this kind of idea of our Christian division. He says it's a lot like a compass, where, my compass point that I'm headed to is just slightly off from yours, like just not even a full degree, a tenth of a degree. And so when we start out, it feels like we're walking together, but there's a little bit of tension. We're just pulling apart. But after we've traveled 100 miles, I can't even see the other person anymore, because it exponentially grows. And when we have no mechanism to tune those strings together, our divisions exponentially grow. And this is where we get my favorite denominational chart, right? Like when we look at all the divisions, that's what's going on. We're really, really close, and then we just continue to divide and continue to divide and continue to divide. And those divisions happen with a lot of tension because of how close we are. We're not that far off, but it's enough, and it matters. So what do we do? If we want unity, what do we do? Because when we divide, what we usually do is we either dismiss people. When we disagree, we usually do one of two things. We dismiss people or we divide, right? So here's the big point. We can't get anywhere if we don't love each other enough to understand and fully understand their position, to steel man their position, right? So if someone says, well, I think God is acting providentially in the world, and that's why this or that war is happening, if we turn around and say, oh, so you're a Christian nationalist. Well, that's not charitable to their position. That doesn't understand what they're saying. That's the very thing that causes our division. That's the work of the wrong king. That's the work of the king of the earth, not the king of the king of man, the king of. That's the work of evil, of Satan. We'll say it that way, So when we don't love people enough to fully understand from their perspective, we're basically tin man. We have tin hearts. We're empty inside. And remember that Jesus walked in our shoes, right? And he sees through our eyes. And if you have a relationship with Jesus, you know this. You know that he comes to you because he loves you. And he walks with you through your struggles. Why won't we offer the same where we disagree? It's fundamentally because we don't know how to have the conversation. We keep turning back to strawmans and straw manning positions and polarization and reducing each other's view. And because we don't have a way to reconcile our differences over Jesus. We don't have a mediator in the discussion in some sense. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to hear one string at a time when we come into complicated issues. And we're going to dig into some complicated issues in the coming weeks. And we're going to hear the positions of these complicated issues. But we're not going to just leave it there. Go, okay, you have your view, I have my view. All right, that's great. And just move on and forget, and be like James, look in the mirror and forget the fact we disagree and have disunity. Because unity is not just a bunch of people in the same room who all believe different things, right? None of us would call it like unity, if we got all of the various news organizations from the political right and left and put them in the same room and said, all right, you're all Americans, right? No, that's going to be a mess. It's going to be chaos. And so we need to avoid being so arrogant that we think we're the one that's in tune. Willing to change. That's the heart behind it all. That's the heart of the follower. All right, all of this is pointless without a tuner. And so I want to leave you with one analogy, and then we'll kind of wrap up the day. A little bit of a longer episode, but all of this is pointless without a tuner. If we're just trying to tune strings to each other, which string gets turned? Which string gets adjusted? Who gets to have the concert pitch? I remember my first time I went to an orchestra, and man, I went with someone, they got us great tickets. And we're like, perfect. We're eye level with the orchestra, down in the bottom, just halfway up. It was just, and the sound just coming right at you. And so, it's like that white noise kind of thing, pink noise, whatever they call it, where, there's a bunch of, murmuring and talking. And this was Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, I believe. And Vladimir Ashkenazy, if you're a nerd, was conducting. And Berlin Philharmonic, it was incredible. But before the whole thing starts, out walks the band and all the musicians, and they're, playing their different notes, and it starts to get noisy. And then the principal violinist stands up. He's the, first chair, and he plays a single note, right across his violin. And all of a sudden, all of the other instruments start playing notes, and they start trying to match that pitch. They all were tuning to the principal violinist. They all were tuning to the lead in the orchestra. And so we need to tune our lives to Jesus. When we realize we're trying to play the same song, there's only been one song that's ever been played throughout creation, and that's the Father's song. And we're trying to play that song together, and we're not playing the same notes. We're not looking at the same place on the page, or we're out of tune from each other. We need to stop and return to the principal pitch in our orchestra, which is the life of Jesus. That God speaks our unity through the person of Jesus, right? So should we go to war with Iran? Should we not go to war with Iran? Are some wars okay, but this war's not okay? What is the principal note of Jesus? And how do we do more than throw Bible verses at each other and judge each other and straw man our positions? How do we hear the strongest position from our brother or sister in a charitable way, in a life-to-life way, instead of just calling out a straw man over the internet? Here's the thing. We can't tune up if we straw man someone. It is impossible to tune to the life of Jesus by doing something Jesus wouldn't do. We can't tune our lives to Jesus if we straw man someone's position. Doesn't work. Basically, what we're announcing is saying, I'm out of tune. I'm not like Jesus. Jesus never strawmanned anyone. So by all means, jabs, criticisms, humor, political comments, comics, they're all fair game. But when we do it, before you post, maybe look at the issues and then maybe consider going and listening to a podcast from that political party or social group and hearing and coming to really understand their strongest position, and then asking yourself, am I showing them the love that Jesus would show them? Does this actually criticize what they think? Or does this criticize something that I'm telling them they think that isn't really exactly what they think, right? And so we keep leaning in. I am a firm believer that the revelation of our interpersonal disagreements in our lives is the work of the Holy Spirit among us, calling us to greater unity by leaning into these discussions. So keep leaning in and keep leaning into your disagreements. And remember, God's got this. It doesn't have to be terrible. It doesn't have to be a fight. It doesn't have to be dismissive. All we have to do is value the other person greater than ourselves. All we have to do is be willing to hear things that we don't agree with. That shouldn't be that hard for Jesus, for God who walked among us in the middle of all the things he disagrees with. Be like Jesus, right? But we have to do the work of having the conversations. All right, look, guys, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you walked through that whole meme thing. I hope you get it. Maybe you've got a better example of a meme. Post it in the comments. Maybe you think I've strawmanned the meme. Okay, post it in the comments. Let me know. Or if you know me, take me to coffee. Hit me up on social media. We've got all the socials. I'm at X, at Take Up Your Cross. Facebook, a Jesus Followers Podcast. Instagram, a Jesus Followers Podcast. Rumble, Jesus Follower Podcast, I believe. And YouTube is Jesus Follower Channel. So hit me up on any of those. Leave a comment on any of those. Like, subscribe, do all the things, because we're a podcast and whatever. But look, the heart that I'm really grateful that you'd be here, because my heart is that we have unity in Jesus, and we don't get unity cheaply. We don't get to say we have unity and not actually come to understand our brother or our sister. And tomorrow we're going to look at how we can actually come to the same mind on some of these issues. What could be our tuning? What can we practically use day to day to lean into and to tune our lives together so that where we disagree, we have some kind of a chance of not just hearing each other, but moving past that and coming to the same mind about who Jesus is. So you don't want to miss tomorrow. God, man, I hope nobody felt judged or strawmanned by my criticism of strawmen. But help us better understand each other. Help us be people who sow peace through engaging in the conflict instead of turning away and leaving people dismissed and frustrated and feeling like they have no voice but to post their hate online. Help us connect, change our hearts and change our minds, and make us more like you so that we can shine a greater light, so that there's more that we're nodding our head yes about, in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Truly, my hope is that the light of Jesus would shine on your path today as you go about your day, and that you would find opportunities for greater unity and love. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.
Go.
Yes, you now have a concert side table at the fabulous Blue Note, Madison near Dearborn, Chicago's Mecca for moderns, and for the people who play it that way. Currently, the Blue Note is featuring Count Basie, his famous piano, and his big new band. Yes, it's what you've been waiting for. It's Count Billy Basie, and here's the man himself.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Count Basie and the band. Sincerely, you're going to enjoy. We hope you enjoy our little program, because we're going to have fun working for you. Now, in our first number, we featured Joe Newman on trumpet, Eddie Lockjaw Davis on tenor. A little thing we call the Blee Blop Blues.